How many times have you heard this saying? Oh, I don't need to train my calves because I get enough work in my lower body movements. Sure, for some who don't give a shit about the size of their calves or the aesthetics of their calves, that might be true, and that's totally fine. But for a lot of us who want to increase the muscular hypertrophy of our calves, I don't think it makes a lot of sense to not train them in isolation, especially with volumes and intensities that are pushing us closer to fatigue, which are gonna recruit more muscle fibers. Because think about it this way. If we want bigger shoulders, are we just gonna shoulder press to get bigger delts? No, we're gonna shoulder press and do isolated delt work and other accessories to facilitate growth. So why we think we don't need to do the same for the calves is a little bit backwards to me. In this video, we're gonna talk about calf training. We're also gonna talk about structuring calf training more strategically for overall growth. And without further ado, let's talk about how to strategically structure our calf training a little bit better. All right, so right off the cuff, let's talk about what the calves actually are. So the lower leg muscles that we're gonna be referencing in this video are the soleus. That is the more internal lower leg muscle. And then we have the gastrocnemius, which is mostly what people think about when they see the calves, and you see those soccer players with those nice big girthy baseball calves. So when we look at the different muscles, so we have the soleus and the gastrocnemius. Both of these muscles are designed to do something different in the body. Yes, they are both plantar flexion oriented muscles, so they push that ankle down, but when it comes to their overall function, it varies a little bit. So the soleus is primarily made of slow twitch muscle fibers, and it is designed as more of a postural muscle. So its main function is to keep the ankle upright and to resist gravity. So when we're walking and doing different activities, when we are upright, moving through locomotion patterns, the soleus is there to support and stabilize the ankle joint. The gastrocnemius, on the other hand, is a mixture of slow and fast twitch. The sport and activity that you do the most will kind of dictate the overall spread of the muscle fibers, and obviously everyone else will have different muscle fiber compositions based on genetics and much more. But that all being said, the gastrocnemius is much more of a spread of muscle fibers, and it's designed to produce force and power through plantar flexion. So when we're jumping, when we're sprinting, the gastrocnemius is going to be helping propel us forward, while the soleus is going to be more of a stabilizer of the ankle joint. So what this all means is that when we think about calf training, it can help us think and structure our calf training accordingly for these two different muscles. In order to build bigger lower legs, I don't think there's a debate behind that we're gonna need to train both of these muscles to some degree. Now, how much is gonna vary. Obviously, the gastrocnemius is much more superficial and much more prominent, so we will probably have to bias a little bit of our training volume towards the gastrocnemius, but I do think it's important to train both. Now, let's take it a step further. So we know the soleus is designed as more of a postural muscle, and the gastrocnemius helps us create force through plantar flexion. Now let's talk about innervation and how we can train both. So when the knee goes into about 90 degrees and even a little bit deeper, what ends up happening is the gastrocnemius isn't actually that active. Mainly the soleus is. So when we think about calf training in the gym and we see folks sitting down in that seated calf raise, more than likely they're targeting more their soleus than their gastrocnemius. Whether they know it or not, that's up for debate. But we're gonna be training the gastrocnemius mostly from a more standing position. So when we think about calf training as a whole, we have a couple different buckets. So we can think about the muscle fibers that each of these muscles are mostly comprised of. We can think about what they are designed to do, and we can think about when they are most innervated. The soleus is a stabilizer of the ankle joint. Its primary function is plantar flexion, and it's primarily slow twitch fibers. So how can we target that a little bit better? With more seated calf raise variations and probably higher rep scheme. It is designed to handle a higher workload and a higher training volume. The gastrocnemius, on the other hand, is a slightly more fatigable muscle, and it's gonna be better trained from a standing position. Plus, we can get a little bit more with the strength-focused training with the gastroc, since it is designed to produce strength and power at the ankle joint. So now let's actually talk about structuring some of that training on a weekly basis. So we discussed the calf muscles and what kind of makes up their build, their function, and their structure. Now let's talk about weekly training breakdown, because this is where I think we can kind of bucket ourselves into one way of thinking. So if you are somebody who's like, oh, I'm destined to small calves, you're not destined to small calves. More than likely, you're just gonna need to push your volume a little bit higher than a normal person, and your genetics might have some threshold on the amount of size you can get from your calves. doesn't mean you are destined to only have small calves. You're just destined to have slightly bigger than small calves with a lot of strategic training. So on a weekly basis, some thoughts that I have on calf training is number one, keep our training volume with our sets moderate to higher amounts, specifically with the soleus muscle. And when we are targeting more of our knee flexion focused calf raise movements, I think higher rep schemes and a little bit higher training volume can be a bit more beneficial. Again, because if we consider the muscle fiber composition of the soleus, I think it would respond a bit better to more endurance focused sets. Now, if we look at the gastrocnemius, how often should we train that muscle? So when I think about the calves in general and how much work they're probably getting through our other lower body training, it's a fair amount, but in truth, if we want to actually grow the gastrocnemius, I think we are going to have to isolate it, and I would say probably do so 2 to 3 times a week. With intensity specifically, I think moderate intensities and slightly higher intensities will probably fare better for some of your training sessions with the gastrocnemius, and also keeping rep schemes to the moderate to higher rep scheme, because again, these muscles are designed and are used to doing a lot of work throughout all of our lower body movements. So to reach a point, I think a threshold for most folks of actual fatigability where we're gonna be recruiting a lot of those muscle fibers, we're gonna have to push higher rep schemes to actually reach that point. So on a weekly basis, what does that actually look like? Because I just threw a bunch of stuff at you. So I would say train your calves 2 to 3 times a week. I would say bias your training 2/3 oriented towards gastrocnemius training, and then maybe 1/3 towards your soleus. Now, when you are doing more standing calf raises, you are gonna be getting some soleus activity, no doubt, in those movements, because again, it is gonna play a role in plantar flexion, but I do think some seated calf raise variations can be useful. From a weekly standpoint, 2 to 3 times a week, training the calves, then also factoring in the gastrocnemius with a moderate to higher intensity loading with moderate to higher rep scheme. And for the soleus, probably more of like your lower to moderate loading and very high rep schemes. Now, obviously, there's a lot of contextual information that we have to consider when we are adding this to our program. So some tips on that are, if you are going to start adding some direct calf training to your programs, I would say structure it on either one, your upper body days where you're not going to be taking away from any of your lower body training already. And number two, I would say keep it away from the days right before your leg day training. So yes, you're going to be needing the soleus and gastrocnemius to some degree when you're squatting and everything else. So if we go into those squat sessions with fatigued calves, I think that can actually be a little bit counterproductive for our growth. So that's why I always say, if we're gonna add in any isolation work directly, which could cause some fatigue, keep them away from the times leading up to your leg focused movements. Because at the end of the day, we gotta think about the biggest bang for our buck, right? If we're trying to improve our squat, why would we want to go into a squat session with fatigued calves? So when it comes to rest times will vary depending on your skill level as an athlete, the loading you're doing, how new you are at an exercise. So I would say be mindful of your rest. Don't rush through your sets. If you're rushing through your sets and you're not even hitting a point of pushing close to failure, then you might not be recruiting as much muscle fibers as you could if you just rested a little bit longer with your set. So like 60 to 75 to even 90 seconds for a set, and then attacking your set with more intent and more energy. The final tip I have with calf training is to not ignore full ranges of motion and adding in tempo. So I think one of the best tools for training the calves, and especially the gastrocnemius, so when we are doing more standing calf variations, are to not ignore the tempos we can add. So adding eccentrics, adding concentrics, adding pauses throughout, and then even adding holds at the bottom. And the ankle is in a fully dorsiflex position with you actively fighting to grip to maintain your ankle posture. There's a big difference there between just sitting into the calves versus actively activating them while you are maintaining a position. But all in all, those are my thoughts on calf training. I myself am trying to grow my calves and lower legs right now, so these are a lot of the things I've been programming for myself. If you learned anything in this video, or if I helped you out, or if you have any questions, drop them down below. And as always, guys, like the video, subscribe to the channel. I'll see you guys in the next one. Peace.